Welcome to the final set of debriefs for the year 2024. This will be the debriefs for the Lakshman Kadiragamar Memorial Debating Championship organized by Trinity College. In this debrief, I'll be breaking down the round 4 motion of LKs. That would be, this house supports the decline in the global reliance of the dollar. Now, a lot of teams had a bunch of issues with this motion. I think because of a lack of econ understanding and knowledge that exists within the circuit. So instead of trying to spoon feed you the entire arguments in this debrief, what I'm going to do is to sort of outline what framing that you would need to run and the basic ideas of arguments that you would probably need to think about if you would want to win a debate like this on both proposition and opposition. So I'm going to break down this video into 3 parts mainly. 1 on overall framing, 2 on like discussing the prop arguments, and then potential prop ideas, and then the potential op ideas. The first thing I'm going to discuss is framing and what questions you should ask yourself during prep in order to frame this debate properly. When you look at the motion, the first thing that you have to sort of ask yourself is, why was the US dollar considered stable and how did the US become the global reserve currency? Now, this is not random knowledge that you can gain by logic. This is stuff that you have to know, and in order to know, you have to read, right? And therefore, you need to be well versed in how the US actually became this global superpower. I think mainly you should focus on reading about the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Bretton Woods Conference and the subsequent Bretton Woods system that the world adopted. Also read up on the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and things like IMF special drawing rights and how they work, right? But getting on into framing, why is the US dollar considered stable? And how did the US become the global reserve currency? What happened after World War II was that most superpowers were in economic turmoil. Countries like Russia, Japan, Germany, Italy, and France were going through severe economic crisis as a consequence of war, right? And therefore, they had absolutely no economic leverage. However, the US strategically remained neutral for most of the war, obviously until Pearl Harbor was attacked, and then they got actively involved. But they're one of the countries that profited extremely off of World War II by selling weapons to both sides and like increased military spending and stuff like that. And they became one of the global superpowers during this period, who was the only stable actor in terms of economy in this period of time, like 1944 to 1948. So what happened was, since the world was suffering from immense crises, they held a conference in the US in Bretton Woods where they all countries got together and they universally adopted a system of currency, and this system of currency looked like this. It was called the Bretton Woods system, where the US dollar was pegged to gold and every other currency was then pegged to the US dollar, and this was believed to have created or to create or hope to create stability within the global economy, which it sort of did during this period of time for about 20 to 30 years, up until like the 1970s with the Nixon Shock, and you should read about that as well. I'll put up all of the stuff that you probably should read in terms of debating a motion like this within the description, so do check those things out. But yeah, so since the US had economic leverage during this period, that meant that they had significant influence over the policies that were put out, and obviously the US incentives is to put in policies that are favorable to themselves. They also, within the Bretton Woods conference, were like as a result, and subsequently things like the WTO, things like the World Bank were formed, and the US had significant influence over these things and still do, due to them being strategically, or let's say basically them winning the lottery during this period of time. Now, what is the problem with that inherently that sort of trickled down to the dependence, and why the dependence was bad is because it created an overinflated perception of how strong the USD was, right? So you had a bunch of countries investing in USD, and then other countries like developing countries looking at this and saying, oh, if we want to be stable, we need to invest in USD as well. We need to take out loans in USD, nominated in USD, and therefore that's the only way that we can maintain stability and we can maintain favor in the world, like not piss the USA off. And the result of this was it dramatically increased the amount of money that the US got, because they could keep spending now because they knew that they'd get income from countries in which they have investments and debts in, right? Because the majority of the US economy is carried by loans, by giving out loans and investments. Now, the thing is, because they had this much leverage within society, this allowed the US to gain, to sort of have a very aggressive monetary policy, which I will talk about later, and allow them to print a lot of money, because they know that even though they keep printing money, they can just claim that money back from the debts that they are owed from other countries. So this gave the US an incredible amount of power in terms of, spending on things like innovation and technology and upscaling and stuff like that. Another prong to that same idea is that other countries and private companies invest in US bonds with the belief that it will be paid back, because obviously the US can pay this loan money back from the debts that they're owed by claiming their debt money. So this this sort of induced investor confidence within the global community. So the US kept putting out bonds as well, and people kept buying it because it was considered an incredibly safe investment for these countries. The problem here is, again, this is sort of leading into argumentation, but I'm going to put this out now, is that the issue is that now less bonds from other countries were being bought, right? Because so many people just wanted to buy the most secure bonds possible, and therefore this reduced the opportunity for other countries to seek any sort of investment, and there's less investment into those countries overall, which limits their growth as countries, which I'm also going to talk about a little bit later. Now, the second question that you sort of have to ask yourself is, why is there a decline in the global reliance on USD? There are about 3 reasons. One, the emergence of countries like China and India as superpowers, and the fact that it is easier to get loans from, and the loans that these superpowers give countries are less conditional and like more easily convertible and stuff like that. 2, the rise of BRICS, right? The Eastern superpowers, with the rise of Eastern superpowers with different incentives and greater, regional cooperation, and their ability to sort of drag people in with them, right? And in favor of them within this region, in terms of Asia and Africa as well. The third reason why there is a lack of global reliance on the USD anymore is simply because there is a lack of global trust within the US as a whole, right? One such incident is back in the 1970s, the IMF special drawing rights was supposed to become the global reserve currency. But since the US has such a significant influence within the IMF, they blocked it. And a lot of countries, lost opportunity in order for them to put their currency out there, right? And this pissed off a lot of countries, and it sort of reduced buy-in from the, more Asian, more Eastern bloc, who just saw the US as this imperialistic state. So from then to now, there's been a gradual decrease in the usage of the dollar within these countries, right? And the final thing is, right now, there is like a reduced investor confidence that exists. Why? Because observing past historical data, investors have seen that the US rapidly changes its monetary policy to fit its own interests. For example, the yen USD asset bubble that caused Japan a lot of problems because of like US incentives, which is something that you need to read up on as well. The third question that you have to answer in this debate to create some level of clarity is, what does this decline look like? First, say that this is going to be a gradual shift and there's no catastrophic effects that are going to affect countries when they switch. But then you have to tell me or tell the judge how this is going to happen, right? Or what this is going to look like. A better illustration provides a clearer picture for the judge and the opposition. You can say this looks like countries buying more other currencies other than USD and adding it to their reserves, and things like buying and selling in their local currencies in terms of bilateral trade instead of using the USD. This is what it would look like, right? And then finally, you can suggest an alternative model on what the world is going to look like and what the world looks like right now, right? The alternative, where what's happening right now, is twofold, you can say. One, you have things like reliance on other currencies, like the upcoming announced BRICS currency, or the reliance of the like IMF special drawing rights, which is an aggregated token and a combination of multiple currencies, right? You can say that you support something like this because of a multitude of reasons, because it is much better for the most vulnerable countries and stuff like that. And you have to prove that within your argumentation, right? You say that it's better to rely on something like the BRICS currency, or it's better to rely on something like the IMF special drawing rights, which is an aggregated token, which gives a country way more options in terms of the like currency that they want to trade in and what is more beneficial and cheaper for them, right? And that's again probably going to be discussed in arguments as well, like potential ideas. So yeah, that is pretty much it for framing. In terms of argumentation, I'm not really going to go into depth in terms of the analysis, but I'm just going to give you a general idea of some stuff that you should probably run in the debate. The most intuitive argument, I think, is about disproportionate power, on how the global reliance on the dollar has given the US way too much power and control over different regions, right? Now, why is this? It's pretty simple. Since most trade is denominated in the dollar, it's very easy for the US to create coercive trade deals with more vulnerable countries such as developing countries, where the US says, you either accept US conditions so that they can, gain or reap any sort of benefits like cheap labor and cheap resources. Or if that developing country refuses the US, they can just say, okay, you refused us, so we are not going to allow you to take out any loans denominated in the dollar, which is like a huge blow on developing countries, because in order for them to remain stable and in order for them to sort of get trade deals, they need to be able to trade in the dollar, which gives the US way too much leverage. And the smaller country not complying instantly crushes their development in the long term, because they won't be able to get the trade deals, as much trade deals as they would like to, in order for them to develop into a more developed country. Now, something that opposition can't claim is that US has good incentives, and since these policies are passed through things like Congress and the Senate and whatnot, and the federal government has an incentive for the US policies to be good, just say that that's not true, because the US Congress has a mandate towards the US citizens, and they don't give a damn about the world or developing countries. They care about their own incentives. You've seen multiple examples of this, and you can and you should read about these things like the Latin American debt crisis, about how the US spiked interest rates in Latin America in 1979, which made it much harder for these countries to pay off their debts. And then you can also talk about the implicit economic coercion that the petrodollar system has caused since its inception. And you should probably read about how the petrodollar system works as well, right? And that is why the US gains way too much power in terms of different regions to carry out what incentives they want. If the dollar was still or we still use the dollar, right? Now, secondly, we can talk about the impact on vulnerable countries because of this, right? Because many countries are in debt to the dollar in status quo, means that they have an increased risk of defaulting. And because things like interest rates and stuff increase over time, if you peg your currency to the dollar, they're going to be way more expensive to keep on buying and keep on maintaining, right? Countries like Argentina have defaulted 3 times. Countries like Lebanon, even countries like Sri Lanka have like massive issues in terms of sort of not defaulting because they have to keep on buying USD, which is way more expensive, which is difficult to maintain for a country, right? What happens is this causes things like bank runs and things like reduced investor confidence, because people are now going to withdraw money from their banks because they're scared that the banks will default and they won't get their money back, which means that credit rating agencies of the world are going to deem you as a less worthy country, a country that can't pay off your debt, and therefore you aren't able to get loans, especially in times of crisis, and in times of difficulty, where things like social services, things like healthcare, things like welfare are going to suffer, and the more vulnerable stakeholders of the developing country are going to suffer because the countries simply cannot maintain that peg because the US dollar is that powerful, and they'll probably default on this. Now, what does our comparative look like on proposition? The comparative probably looks like now you have greater options, because we told you in framing, I spoke about it in framing, right? About how the likely system is something like the BRICS currency or something, and like you suppose something similar to the IMF special drawing rights. And the reason for this, the comparative is much better because more loans would be given by other countries, and there would be greater confidence in other countries, right? Because the global decline of the dollar means that there will be more investment into these other countries, which would gradually make these countries' currency way more stable, right? Which is going to, and now the decline of the US dollar sort of shifts the incentives rather of investors, which means that there's going to be more investment in countries like China, in countries like India, right? And a lot of like Central and Southern African countries as well. You also have now more debt to fund important projects like China and India, right? If, for example, China, and if China is able to give out more loans and stuff like that, they will have more debt to fund things like BRI, which simply significantly help the more vulnerable stakeholder. And that's why the vulnerable stakeholder is far better on the prop comparative. The second argument is very interesting. It's an argument that I sort of got from a debate from Princeton Ivy 2024, the quarterfinals. You can check out that motion as well, about why it's bad, why the global reliance on the dollar is sort of worse off for the US citizens as a whole, right? Like we talked about in our framing, the US prints money very, very liberally. They have a very aggressive monetary policy, and the only way that they can co-opt that effect is by collecting debt, right? The problem is this system of constantly printing money locally isn't great because wages grow more slowly, and there's going to be a higher unemployment that exists within the country, right? And what happens here is that there's going to be a greater wealth inequality that is going to perpetuate from this monetary, or like statistically has perpetuated from the monetary policy that the US adopts because of the global reliance of the dollar. So the vulnerable stakeholder in the US is going to suffer in terms of inflation and in terms of not being able to find a job because of the global reliance on the dollar. And this is one more reason that you should not support it. On the comparative, you could agree that the US would probably be, or the growth of the US dollar would probably be less and smaller. But in terms of the US, the decline in the usage of the dollar is probably better for the vulnerable stakeholder in the US, which I think is an interesting argument to run as well. The third argument is about whether the US is actually stable and whether the US actually contributes to global stability or not, right? Because it's unfair to assume that the US is an absolutely stable, 100% stable country. Because if you think about it, the US, like I said, in terms of their monetary policy, they artificially induce the idea of stability. And this artificial stability affects international markets. But you still see crisis within the USA still happen, right? Things like the 2008 financial crisis, things like Biden's inflationary policies. The problem here is that when, again, going back to the impact of the first, the vulnerable stakeholder argument, when this happens, it becomes far more difficult for developing countries and way more expensive for them to pay off their debt, especially in a more crisis situation. Because your currency is way weaker than the US, right? So in order to pay back these loans, you need to give away a ton of your GDP, and you won't have any money left, like the same impact as the previous argument. You won't have any money left to finance things like healthcare, education, and welfare, etc. But the comparative is, if you borrowed from other countries, it won't, like other countries, as in if you had more diverse like investments and if you had more diverse debt, it won't affect your country as much if there is a sort of issue within the US which can be seen from period to period. For example, like Biden's inflationary policies and the 2008 financial crisis, which you should probably read about as well in order to understand a motion like this. I'm going to skim through the opposition arguments as well. The opposition burden is simple. It's to prove why the decline will do more harm than good for the most vulnerable stakeholders and the global economy as a whole, and that the dollar is in an incredibly stable currency, even in status quo. The first thing is on economic stability. And under this, you can say that the USD is incredibly stable and therefore incredibly predictable. So you have great predictability, which means that a country is able to price their goods and services much better without worrying about things like exchange rate fluctuations and such, which means that they can assure or they can reduce the uncertainty that exists within like buying and selling of goods, right, internationally as well. The second thing is how it simplifies financial transactions. It's easy, right? So in terms of, if you have one currency, and which is the USD, and which is incredibly stable, you reduce things like conversion fees, you eliminate like multiple currency conversions, because conversions, what they do is they create a level of volatility, and you have things like fees that you have to pay off, and it's just incredibly complex in general. So the USD, or a country buying and selling in USD, sort of strengthens the investor confidence that exists within these countries. Because when the strongest currency backs your reserve, that would say that you have a very liquid economy, meaning that if you do owe money to someone, you can instantly, liquefy that money and pay off that debt, right? Now, the next thing that you have to do is sort of justify why the US is in fact a stable economy and why the USD is an incredibly stable currency. So this goes, again, you need to know a bit of stuff for this. In terms of the 1970s, right? From the 1970s, even in the oil crisis that hit the 1970s, the US was still the greatest economy in terms of scale, right? Because they had the resources and the monetary policy and the capability to stabilize the economy even in this oil crisis, and even with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system due to the Nixon shock that occurred in around 1972. So there was two major oil crises that hit the 1970s. It was the 1973 oil crisis and the 1979 energy crisis due to some stuff like the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, and the Iranian Revolution that hit, right? But the US was still able to bounce back. Now, the reason the US was able to bounce back from all of this is because of the strength of US institutions internally. All of the US policies have to go through things like Congress. The US has very, very strong legal institutions, and they have very strong economic institutions as well. Now, the comparative is, if you have things like special drawing rights, or things like or if you have a system where you adopt something like the BRICS currency, that is bad because the other actors are incredibly uncertain, the other major actors in the world. China, Russia, they're incredibly uncertain because they have single party politics, and there's a lack of transparency that exists within those countries. So you probably wouldn't be getting the most equitable deals, because even if you look at the things like the Belt and Road Initiative, there's always a neo-imperialistic undertone to whatever China or Russia would do. Mainly China. China would be the best example, even in Sri Lanka, in terms of the Hambantota Harbour and the other projects that China do. It's a very neo-imperialistic undertone because these are single party systems with a lack of transparency. So you probably won't be as equitable. However, the US is a democracy where they are actually the bastions of democracy, and therefore they have a greater incentive to maintain that image, which means that you're likely to get a more equitable deal, right? Nextly, you point out why there isn't necessarily an overinflated confidence in the US economy. It's a reflection of reality, right? For example, we talked about how the US was able to bounce back from things like the Yom Kippur War and the oil crisis. There are more examples, things like the 2008 financial crisis and as well. The US was the fastest to bounce back from that. And why is the US better for global influence overall? The US is a lender of last resort, and they are the ones funding the World Bank and the IMF mainly, right? So they were the stabilizing force in the Latin American debt crisis because they are the ones who provided the crucial loans for these countries to get out of this crisis in the first place. And therefore, the US is a good, better global influence than other countries like China and Russia. The second argument that you can run is on fractionalization. In terms of other currencies or a system that is similar, which is probably what Prop is going to run, about a system like special drawing rights, where a country there's like a pool of reserve currencies that you can pick from. The problem here is that it creates fractionalization because of multilateral disagreements and stuff like that, because things like this have to be reworked every few years and they have to constantly renew. And when that basket is renewed, this gives opportunity for more countries to put their currency in and push their currency, which creates things like diplomatic tensions, and it can exacerbate things like trade wars and stuff like that. And therefore, this would just lead to weakened global economic coordination as a whole, which is incredibly problematic, right? The final sort of question that you have is, why is US soft power a good thing? You say that the US is a good actor. Just simply, like I said, like giving the analysis that the US is a bastion of democracy, or so they claim, and the US won't refuse to give you loans because they want you to take their money so that you owe them. They're probably not going to give loans to countries with bad actors like North Korea or Russia, who are slightly authoritarian. They're probably not going to give loans to countries like Indonesia at one point when they were incredibly corrupt, right? And therefore it is very unlikely that the US is not going to give out loans, because it's the incentive to like give out as much loans as possible for countries to owe them, in order for them to keep pushing out their aggressive monetary policy. See, under opposition, you can sort of expand more on these uncertain ideas about like why the US is more stable in terms of the institutions. Is because in the US generally, it's less about economic volatility and more social volatility that exists, right? Economic volatility in the US is usually very bipartisan because it's backed by the rich with incredibly aligned interests, and the people who manage things like the Federal Reserve are incredibly qualified professionals who know what they're doing, right? And in terms of the US being a better, like the or sort of in terms of why a singular currency is better, it's just very simple, right? It avoids volatility because most of the policies or the most influential policies are going to be, and most optimal policies are going to be based on one currency that's going to be observed by the best economists in the world. It's going to be very much easier to predict things like changes and fluctuations and stuff in the market, and therefore it's easier to be prepared for things like shocks than if there is a variety of currencies. So there is much less volatility in the global market if the USD is a more singular use currency in the world, right? Also, let's talk about the vulnerable stakeholder bit, right? The vulnerable stakeholder is much better off because the process of the US granting you loans is much faster in USD because their currency is way more liquid, and you don't have to, like, the comparative on the other side would be that you have to sort of figure out which currency is good in terms of a system like the special drawing rights system, and the valuation of different currencies and stuff like that take a long time. And in times of crisis, this long-term sensitivity isn't really good, right? Because you need quick money, and the USD, the reliance on the USD allows the US to sort of give you, or for you as a country to take that money much faster. So it is much easier to address things like economic shocks and stuff like that, right? Because for example, countries like Brazil wouldn't have, when they were going through the debt crisis, wouldn't have money for weeks if the USD like wasn't such a relied upon currency and wasn't able to supply that currency fast. The moment that you lose support for that currency, or that you support that the currency is less relied upon, means that these actions cannot be taken within that time span, right? So you basically lengthen the time span that certain countries can or need to receive aid, which is problematic because they need it very short. Also, you can say that the US has incentive to help developing countries because it is aligned with their interest as well. So in terms of production and manufacturing, it is much like it is with its aligned interest for the US in order to help these developing countries in the first place, unless if they're incredibly authoritarian or bad actors, which we've also sort of talked about as well. So on opposition, these are like the general arguments, right? What we do is we first talked about economic stability and predictability, and why, and we gave sort of framing to why the US is much better in terms of that, and how they're able to, even in the worst of times, they were able to come out of crises. And the reliance on that means that the countries, or more vulnerable countries, won't also will be less susceptible to shocks for a and if they are, it's going to be for a very short period of time, in terms of our comparative versus the other, right? And we also talked about why a singular currency is much better, and why the likely proposition comparative is probably not going to work. We talked about fractionalization and why that's a bad thing. because of like multilateral disagreements between countries and stuff that may arise when there isn't a dominant currency that exists, which is problematic in terms of the stability of global trade. So those are basically things that you can make into arguments on the opposition. They're not very well analyzed here because I think that I don't need to do that for you. That's something that you need to think about as debaters. So yeah, I hope you learned something from this video, and you'll probably never see me again.